Hi guys, today I'm going to talk about some of my master's research. My name is Bai Li, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Toronto, advised by Frank Riddich, and this is what I've been doing for my master's work, and also a longer version of what I'm going to present this summer at NAACL. Here's the paper if you want to read it, but so let's begin. This presentation is about my work on detecting dementia in Mandarin Chinese. So Alzheimer's disease and dementia, what is it? It is a neurodegenerative disease. So what it means is it's a disease that progressively makes your harms your brain and makes it degenerate, and it does it a little bit at a time, and it affects around 50 million people worldwide and around 5 million people in the US. So this is a disease that affects mostly really old people. You don't really see young people getting it. It's mostly people over the age of 65. So once you get into the 60s and 70s, you start to get Alzheimer's disease. And the symptoms of this disease is it works in multiple stages. So in the early stages, you start to forget things, and your language pattern starts to change, and then you might forget people. You might lose your sense of direction, forget words, and then in the later stages you lose motor control. So then you need people to help you with daily life, and then eventually this leads to death. And it's one of the most costly diseases in the Western world because it takes so long for you to die. Actually, so in the later stages of this disease, you often need like a full-time caretaker to take care of you because you're completely disoriented. So it's a really costly disease, and right now there's no cure known. Even though a lot of people have been looking for a cure for it, there's currently no known cure for this disease. And for now, I'm going to treat Alzheimer's disease and dementia to be synonyms. So technically, they're not quite the same thing. Alzheimer's disease is the disease, and dementia is the symptom, like the set of symptoms and of the disease. But I'm not going to care too much about the distinction for now. Anyways, so why should we detect Alzheimer's disease? This is a fair question. Some of my friends ask me this question, like, what's the point of your research if you can tell people that you have Alzheimer's disease, but you can't really do anything about it? There's like no way to cure it, right? Well, that's kind of true. And I have two answers. So the first answer is that it's good for early treatment. So even though there's no cure for the disease and there's actually no drugs that can really slow down the progression of Alzheimer's disease, but it can help reduce the symptoms if you take it early. So stuff like memory loss and cognitive effects, you can reduce the effects of the disease by taking certain drugs. So it's better that you do this rather than not know that you have this disease. Then obviously you can't take any drugs about it. And the second reason why detecting Alzheimer's disease is important is for clinical trials. So one of the reasons that maybe cures hasn't been found for this disease is because the clinical trials, they give patients like possible potential cures for the disease, but it's already like mid-stage and late-stage patients. So depending on what kind of hypothesis of what causes the disease you believe in, this might already be too late to really do anything. So it's better to start the treatment when you're still in the early stages. That's when potential treatment will have the most effect. So for the purposes of clinical trials, it's very useful to get people that are in the early stages of the disease and give them the potential treatments. And how do you detect Alzheimer's disease? Well, if you're not looking at like linguistic tests, there are other tests. So actually, about 20 years ago, if you ask this question, it's not that easy to detect Alzheimer's disease. Like, the disease was known for a long time, but up until like 10 or 15 years ago, there's no way of detecting the disease until post-mortem. So after the patient's dead, then you can look at the brain and see what the brain looks like, and if it's all shriveled up, then they have Alzheimer's disease. But now you can do it when you're alive, so you can go to the hospital and get an MRI, like a brain scan of various sorts, and that will tell you if you have Alzheimer's disease. But the problem with that is it's quite costly and inconvenient. Like you have to physically go to a hospital to get this test done. And a better way would be cognitive test. So just test your cognition and give. This is a test called the MSc, and then it's basically a series of tests, and then if you score below a certain amount in this test, then you're considered to have Alzheimer's disease. So there's a bunch of things in this test that I will go over later. And cognitive tests are a lot cheaper and easier to do than the more formal tests. So they're a good screening mechanism, right? So how you will use it is, if you think that you might have dementia or Alzheimer's disease, then you will use a cognitive test, and then if you pass the cognitive test, then it's a sign that you might actually have this disease, and then you take a more accurate but more expensive test. So people are working on this. This Winterlight, founded by my advisor, which is working on making this technology available to people. So this will be like an app on your phone that you would use to do a series of cognitive tests and track your dementia. And right. So now let's talk about a bunch of ways that you can use to detect Alzheimer's disease using cognitive tests. So first of all, here's the category fluency test, which is name as many animals as you can in 60 seconds, or animals or fruits or colors, right? And then the participant starts, and then the participant goes like chicken, dog, rooster, fish. Like he goes on, and then after 60 seconds you say stop, and then you count how many items he named, and then how many items he repeated, and then this gives you a score. And then the reason that people with Alzheimer's disease tend to score lower on this is because they have trouble remembering the words for things. So they might know what this guy is, but they might not be able to remember the word for it. Like they might not be able to remember that this is a horse, even though they can recognize what it is. And a more interesting way to test it is a picture description. So he's asked to describe the picture in as much detail as possible, right? And then it's a pretty chaotic picture, as you can see here. This is a classic picture called the cookie theft picture, and the participant is asked to just talk about what's happening in this picture in as much detail as possible, and then there's no time limit, so he keeps going until he says I'm done, or there's nothing left to say. And then this is interesting because it's not really obvious how you score it, and it gives you a lot more information because it's a free-form speech, which rather than just naming a bunch of objects as in the previous task, you actually talk in your natural speech. So there's a lot of information we can extract from that. And the reason it is useful is because people with dementia use language differently from normal people, and there's a bunch of ways that they use language differently. So first of all, people with dementia have trouble finding words for things, so they might use less specific words. So for example, here the boy is standing on what is he standing on? Well, most people would say he's standing on a stool, but then if you can't remember the word for stool, then you might say the boy is standing on a chair, right? which is more common word than stool. And then if you can't even remember the word for that, then you might say he's standing on that thing over there. Like if you can't remember the word for chair, then you might say something like that. And we tend to use more pronouns and adverbial constructions. So for example, he's reaching up there. He, like the pronoun rather than the boy, and then he's reaching up there rather than the boy is reaching for the cookie jar. So this is just less specific syntax, like more generic words. Just people with dementia tend to have like empty speech where they're saying stuff that's like maybe grammatical but doesn't really contain any information. So maybe stuff like this. And if you look at acoustics, you can look at acoustic patterns as well. So stuff like how fast they're talking, how many words per minute are they saying, or if they're pausing, how long are the pauses, and stuff like that. Gives you a bunch of acoustic features that you can use. And syntactically, they use less complicated sentences, so more shorter sentences and fewer complex sentences with a lot of embedded recursive clauses. So these are all things that you can try to extract using computational techniques. So for this project and previous projects, we built automated tools to extract relevant features from a narration of a picture description task. So all of these tools are open source, and you can use them online. They're on GitHub, and you extract a bunch of tools from a narration. So stuff like the obvious stuff would be like length of narration, like how long, how many minutes, how many words and sentences they spoke. People with Alzheimer's disease tend to have less to say. They also repeat themselves more and use less and fewer rare and uncommon words. So you can measure vocabulary diversity using stuff like type token ratio, which is the ratio of unique words over total words. So you can imagine if you repeat yourself a lot, then you're gonna have a lot more total words, but not that many more unique words. So then your type token ratio would be a lot lower, right? So this is a measure of how much you're repeating yourself. And then the frequency metrics in Corpus. So this would measure stuff like stool being a rare word in a corpus, so the frequency would be lower. And then if you look at some, say, median statistics of how the distribution of words and the frequency of the words in the speech, and that gives you a feature of how diverse is the vocabulary that you're using. So now you can extract more features. Another set of features that you can extract is syntactic features. So stuff like part of speech tags, like number of adjectives or number of nouns, and sometimes we have a few ratios of text, like number of pronouns divided by number of nouns. Right. And that's the most simplest type of syntactic feature. If you get more complicated, you can look at a parse tree. So a constituency parse tree would look like this, and it's a sort of recursive representation of a parse tree. And from the parse tree, you can extract a bunch of things. So first of all, the height of the tree gives you an indication of how complicated the sentence is, and like a long complicated sentence with a lot of like very deep nested clauses would have a high tree height. And then you can also look at, say, individual production rule counts. So stuff like here you have NP goes to det n. That's one type of production rule. You have this production rule here, but again, it's NP goes to det n. NP goes to det n the park. Or aman. And then you have other rules like VP goes to V, MP, PP. And then you look at a bunch of these rules and see how often they occur. And this gives you a feature of what kind of syntax that you're using. So depending on whether you have Alzheimer's or not, you might use different types of syntax more often or less often. And the third type of parse tree that you use is a dependency parse tree. So it's a little bit different from a constituency parse tree up here. Instead of a tree-like structure, you have more of a directed graph where each word is pointing to one other word that it's connected to. And a feature that you can extract from this is the dependency distance. So generally, the further the dependency distance is, the more complicated the sentence is. Like how many words is in between the word and the thing that is pointing to. So you can extract like the mean and the median and max of the dependency distance across all the sentences that you're saying. And this work a few years ago, Katie Fraser, a previous graduate student from this lab, used machine learning to pull all these features together to detect dementia. So this work, she extracted over 400 different features. So all kinds of features like syntactic features and semantic features and acoustic features. So over 400 of them, and put it all into a logistic regression classifier. And this achieves somewhere around 82% accuracy. So you can look at the graph here. This is how many features that you use versus how much of an accuracy you get. And it turns out that you only need 40 or 50 features here to get the highest accuracy of 81%. And if you use all of the features, then a lot of them are not that great. So you don't actually need 400 features. You need only like 40 or 50. And after this publication, there's been a lot of work on improving it. So I think the state of the art right now would be somewhere around the high 80s or low 90s accuracy. So it's actually quite amazing that this is possible, because you're only looking at a narration of one picture description, which is like 2 or 3 minutes of speech, and from that you're able to detect whether they have dementia or not with high 80s, low 90s accuracy. And let's talk about the data sets that they use to train this. So the data set that's used, or most common for this task, is called Dementia Bank, and is collected between in the 80s by the University of Pittsburgh. And it has around 500 different narrations. Around half of them are healthy, and half of them have dementia. And sometimes a few patients have multiple narrations, but anyways, it's a few hundred patients doing a few hundred narrations, which is pretty big for a data set of people with dementia. And other than that, we have a bunch of other tasks like category naming and letter fluency. And we also have the diagnosis, so whether they have dementia or not, or they're healthy, or some people in the dataset have something other than dementia or other than Alzheimer's disease. So stuff like aphasia also occur in this dataset. And we also have a score on the mini-mental state exam. So a score of 30, and if you're below a certain amount, then you're classified as having dementia. And so this is a primary corpus that people use in English for research on Alzheimer's detection. And for Mandarin, this is a dataset that's fairly obscure, that nobody's really looked at before. It's called a Lu corpus, and it's part of Aphasia Bank as well. And it's a much smaller corpus. It's 49 speakers of Taiwanese Mandarin. So this was collected in the 2000s in Taiwan. So they're speaking a dialect of Mandarin. It's pretty close to the standard dialect, but and for each speaker they have a few tasks. So they have the cookie theft picture description task, first of all, and then they also have some other tasks like category fluency. They have 4 different types of category fluency tasks. They name animals, foods, colors, and places in Taiwan. And they have 30 different picture naming tasks. So these are the ones where you give a picture and then you ask, what is this picture? And in this data set, we have the transcripts of the picture description tasks. So somebody went and wrote down exactly what the participant is saying as they do the picture description task. But one problem is we don't really know this diagnostic information is not provided in the corpus. And when I first saw this, I was like, okay, well, I'm stuck. I can't really use this data set, right? Because there's no way I can. How do I even do anything if I don't know who's healthy and who has Alzheimer's disease, right? But it turns out that this is not that bad because we can construct from these other tasks. We have a good idea of how much Alzheimer's or how much dementia they have based on how they perform on these other tasks. So we can kind of construct this proxy of how much dementia score they have by doing a PCA. So what this basically does is you have all these tasks, like a bunch of tasks, like how many animals they named, how many different colors they named, how many of the 30 picture descriptions you got correct, right? And then you give a relative weighting of all these tasks so that you can maximize the variance if you give everybody the same weighting. So if you look at the first principal component after you do this, then this gives you a proxy score for how much dementia you have. Okay, so now let's look at how to detect dementia in Chinese. So first of all, well, why don't we just do the same thing that we did in English, right? Well, if we get like we have data in English, just do the same thing and extract a bunch of features and train a logistic regression, and you can do it in Chinese, right? Well, the problem with that is you don't have enough data. So the data set that we have in English is around 500 patients or 500 narrations, and then in Chinese we only have 1/10 the amount, right? So it's just not enough data to do the same thing. And you can say, well, then we have to collect more data, right? Well, yes, you can. You can go and collect 500 more data points, but yeah, that's going to be really expensive to recruit all these people with dementia and get them to do these cognitive tasks. And yeah, and even if we can do that, it's still not that interesting because yeah, it's going to work. But whatever we just replicated the same thing just in a different language, which is not super interesting, right? And instead of doing that, our solution is to somehow combine the data sets. So combine this data set that we have in English with the smaller data set that we have in Chinese, and do some kind of domain adaptation or transfer learning to combine them. And even though we don't have that much data in Chinese, we can still do okay if we have a very large data set in English, because it's a similar domain, just a different language. So we need some way of combining it. So this is a case of domain adaptation. So domain adaptation is any problem when you have a large corpus in some domain S, and then a small corpus in domain T. So S would be your source domain, and then a small corpus in your target domain. And then you want to train a model for the target domain where you have a small corpus. So this would be something like, okay, if you have a sentiment classifier that's trained on Reddit, but I want to adapt it to classify sentiment on Twitter, which is like different types of messages, something like that, where the domain S and T are like similar, related in some way, but there's also differences in it. And this has been studied somewhat. There are a bunch of existing methods, like this paper here. Like some trivial methods would be to like just combine them, or to just set a flag saying which domain it's from, or this method, which I'm not going to explain too much detail, but basically it's like 10 lines of code that does some kind of feature augmentation and combines the two data sets in a fairly straightforward way. And the problem with all these existing methods is they all pretty much require you have to have the same features in the source domain and the target domain. So if you have, like, say number of words is a feature in English, then you also need to have the identical feature number of words in Chinese as well. So you need to have the exact same features, and this is problematic because the languages are pretty different from each other. So here's a picture, and in English you might say, okay, she's standing on a chair, and the Chinese person might say something like 她站在一个椅子上. Right. And you can see immediately that the word order is quite different. Like the preposition here is at the end, and somehow you got this this CL, this classifier token that doesn't correspond to anything in English. And if you look at the part of speech text, then you run into problems. So like here you have standing, which in English is like a present tense continuous verb, but if you try to do the similar tag in English, in Chinese it doesn't make sense, because verbs in Chinese don't really have tenses. There's no such thing as like continuous verb or past tense verb or present tense verb. Instead of marking tense, you mark aspect in Chinese, which indicates whether it happened already or whether it's still happening. So you can't have verb tenses if you want cross language features. And here you have a classifier feature, which is like, instead of a chair, you have to say and then classifier chair, one classifier chair, and then the classifier is different depending on the type of object that you're describing. So you might have a different classifier if you're talking about one book versus like one fish. You're gonna use different classifier, and this is just a part of speech tag that doesn't exist at all in English. So how would you have a set of cross-language features? It's really difficult. It doesn't make that much sense to try to make cross-language features that works on all languages, because languages are so different in this case. So we tried this anyways, using a set of universal language, cross-language, like part of speech tags, and this just didn't work very well. Like, we had pretty poor accuracy, and I think the reason why it's because the model needs to not only learn to detect dementia, but it also needs to learn how the features kind of correspond to each other. So if you have a feature like number of words, well, then the concept of a word is quite different from in English and Chinese, and even like when do you use pronouns, when do you use verbs, like there's differences between the languages. So you only have 49 samples, and you try to learn classifier using like hundreds of features, and the features are not even mean the same thing across languages. So this is just a very difficult task, and it's probably impossible to do with the data set that you have. So the key point is why don't we extract features separately and then learn the correspondences between the features using out-of-domain data? Like, if it's really hard to get the features to match up across languages, then instead of trying really hard to do that, let's extract different set of features in Chinese, different set of features in English, and then somehow they should correspond. So they learn how a pronoun in Chinese corresponds to what kind of part of speech tag in English. Like, learn this correspondences using any kind of parallel corpus that we have, and there are a lot of corpus for like parallel machine translation, and the corpus that we use for this is a corpus of movie subtitles. So all these movies, people have translated the subtitles into Chinese, and then somebody made a corpus that contained all the aligned subtitles in over 60 languages. So you have millions and millions of lines of movie subtitles. So the reason we use it is it's more informal kind of text than, say, parliamentary text or newspaper articles. It's spoken text. Well, it's not quite conversational, and it's not quite like a spontaneous speech, but it's pretty close. So here's a corpus of movie subtitles that we use. And okay, let's talk about some baselines that you might use to solve this. So first, the unilingual baseline, which is just train the model using Mandarin in the same way that you trained the English model, and then do some kind of cross-validation, train some kind of logistic regression, and then that's your unilingual baseline. And the second thing that you might do trivially is, well, just you have a narration in Chinese, right? So just translate the Mandarin text into English, and use some kind of machine translation tool, now you have a bunch of English text, and you have an English classifier that you trained from before. So just run the English classifier using the machine translation output. So these are your two baselines. The problem with the second baseline is that machine translation tends to normalize things. So even if your input is very agrammatical, it will try to produce something that's grammatical, just because that's what the language model expects. So we lose a lot of information by passing it through Google Translate, so it doesn't actually work that well. And the evaluation metric that we use is the Spearman correlation between the model's output and the Dementia Score. So so recall that we derived the Dementia Score from a bunch of other cognitive tests. So that we use as a ground truth for a model. And the model's prediction is generated using some kind of model that's trained on the linguistic features that we extract from the picture description narration. So this measures how monotonic, or how well the order of your prediction corresponds to the ground truth score. So it doesn't care that much about like whether you're predicting it exactly linearly or not. So for example, here is a very nonlinear relationship, but as long as you're predicting the right order, like you're saying that the people with dementia are higher than these people that don't have dementia, then you're going to get very high Spearman correlation. So that's the metric that we use. And the proposed model that we use is has several steps. So in the first step, we extract a feature vector in Chinese using a bunch of tools or whatever, extract a bunch of features in Chinese, and extract a bunch of other features, say Y, in English independently. So you don't have to have them match up, you don't have to use the same tools, they can be different lengths, whatever. And now you can learn a mapping function f that takes x and goes to y, and learn this mapping function using the large parallel movie subtitle corpus that we have. And this class of problems is called multi-output regression. So it's a pretty well studied problem. It's a case of regression. Well, it's kind of the regression, but normally in regression you have say linear regression, you're trying to predict one thing, like one number, and then that's what you're trying to predict. You might have a lot of input features, but you're going to try to predict one thing at a time. For multi-output regression, you try to predict a vector. So the challenge here is, how do you score your multi-output regression problem? Right? Like if you're predicting one thing, then it's easy to score. But if you're predicting multiple things, then do you just score all of them equally, or are some of the outputs more important than others? And that's going to be a problem that we're going to address later. So here's the overall architecture of the model. So on the top left, we have a feature transfer model. So this is a multi-output regression model that turns Mandarin features into English features, and this is a part that's trained on open subtitles. And here on the top right, we have the previous work. So basically, a logistic regression that takes in English features and then computes Alzheimer's classifier, like Alzheimer's diagnosis. So this part will be just taking the previous work and taking the model from there. And this part is trained on Dementia Bank. So this part only works on English and gives you Alzheimer diagnosis in English. Okay, so this is during training, and then during evaluation, here's what you do. You take your Mandarin narration, you extract your features using whatever tools that you have. So you have a bunch of Mandarin features, and then you use the first model to get a bunch of English features that correspond to your Mandarin features. And now that you have a bunch of English features, now you feed that to the second model, which gives you a dementia diagnosis. So this gives you a score, and then this is a score that you use to evaluate, and you evaluate using Spearman's blank order correlation against the ground truth score that you derived earlier. And what's interesting to note here is this is really kind of an unsupervised model, because only the English dementia data is used during training, right? So if you look here, this model is trained on the movie subtitles. This model here is trained on Dementia Bank in English, and then you don't actually use the Chinese data at all during training. You only use it here to evaluate. So we use it only to see how well the model is doing on the Mandarin data. So during evaluation, we use the data to see how well the model is doing, but we don't use any of the data during training. So it's unsupervised model, which is quite important because your data set is too small. So if you try to use cross-validation, then it's often just too small to do anything useful. And this way we save all of the data for evaluation. And so now let's talk about how to do the multi-output regression problem. So remember that we have a feature vector in Chinese, and we want to learn to correspond it, to map it to a feature vector in English. So something like number of characters in Chinese versus words in English, because or here you have like pronoun count, noun-verb ratio, so a whole bunch of features in Chinese, and then you want to turn that into a whole bunch of different features in English. Right, so probably the most trivial way of doing this is just train a bunch of independent linear regressions. So here's one feature, number of words. Try to train a linear regression to be constructed from all these features in Chinese. Okay, now you have a linear regression. Now here's the second feature, noun-verb ratio in English. Now you train a different linear regression to predict it from all these Chinese features. So we use elastic net regularization, which is a combination of L1 and L2 regularization, and this works really well when you have a lot of different features, and some of them might not be that important. It deals with like noisy features pretty well, and just do an independent hyperparameter search for each of these regressions. And so that's the first model I tried. One of the problems with this model is it doesn't really take advantage of the relationship between outputs. So all of the target features are considered independent. So even if they're closely related, like none of that is taken advantage of by the previous model. So now we try reduced rank regression, which is okay. You have x, the input vector, and then you want to produce y. So you try to minimize the difference between y and x beta. So you try to construct y from your input x using a linear regression, but you have the constraint that the rank of this linear mapping has to be less than some constant r that you fix in advance. So in fact, this kind of model is equivalent to training a one-layer neural network using a hidden layer of size r, where your neural network is completely linear, so you don't have any kind of activation function like value or anything. You just put it into a hidden layer of size r, and then use that to reconstruct it as best as possible. And when you get the optimal solution of this is exactly equivalent to reduced rank regression. So now this still didn't work that well, because the problem with the previous two models is some features in output are noisy or like impossible to reconstruct. So for example, if you have some kind of feature here that's really impossible to reconstruct, then the model will still try to reconstruct it as best as possible, and will penalize it if it gets it badly, right? But then so example of this would be like if you in English you have something like the sentiment, like positive or negative sentiment, and then in Chinese if you only have like syntax features like number of nouns, number of verbs, then it's just no way for that to reconstruct the sentiment of a sentence given the features that you have in Chinese. So sometimes you have features that just cannot be reconstructed in any meaningful way using the data that you have, right? And the problem with that is the model still tries to be constructed even though it's noisy, so it's going to get basically garbage output. And then the second model that depends on the output of this model, it doesn't know which features are supposed to be noisy, so it doesn't know to not trust the certain features that are noisy. So we have to somehow get it to eliminate features that are noisy and cannot be easily reconstructable from the input data. So that's what joint feature selection does. So the solution is as we order all of the output features in English by R squared, which is a measure of how well you can reconstruct the feature, how well the linear regression manages to fit the data. And then you only select the top k features. So you get the top features that can be reconstructed, and then you throw out other features that are below a certain threshold. So for example, if this feature, number of words, has a high R squared, like R squared is 0.8, and then this feature here, noun-verb ratio, is not easily reconstructible with R squared of only 0.1, then you take this feature and then you throw out this feature that because it's just too noisy, and you say, okay, this is not a very useful feature, we're just not going to use it for the next step. Okay, so here's the results. So here on the top part we have the baselines, Lingual model and Google Translate, and here we have 3 versions of our model. So first of all, we noticed that the initial model without reduced rank regression or joint feature selection is just not very good. It performs worse than both of the baselines. And then reduced rank regression is also not that effective because it does take advantage of some output output relationships a little bit, but it doesn't do what joint feature selection does, which is throw out the noisy features. And doing that seems to be crucial. You do need to throw out the noisy features and only use the good, like well-behaved features in order to beat the baselines. And we did a significance test comparing the Spearman's role for the best model that we have, the joint feature selection model, and the baseline Google Translate model. We get p-value is 0.06, which is fairly significant given the size of our dataset. Okay, so in this plot we see so there's a few things going on here. So the blue plot is the most important. It's on the x-axis you have the number of features, and then the blue line is the accuracy of your whole combined model. And the blue line says it is your Spearman's role when you use k different features. So you can see that the k is actually maximized when it's around 13 or 14. That's when you get the best score here of 0.549. Is when you get k is you take the top 13 or 14 features, you get the highest total model score. And as you add more features in that, you get more and more noisy features that's not actually that useful for the task. And then if you use all of the features, then you get then it's just too much noise, and you get the original model of 0.319 somewhere over here. Okay, so now the green score is how much accuracy can you get in the original logistic regression if you take these features. If you take these features and you train your logistic regression on the Dementia Bank data, then what's the accuracy that you get? So if you take all of the features, then you get a pretty high accuracy, like pretty close to 0.8. Right? But then as you get fewer and fewer features, then the accuracy decreases a little bit. So over here you only get 0.7 accuracy. If you only use like 13 or 15 features, then you only get like 0.7 instead of 0.8 accuracy, which is not that bad. And when you combine it, this happens to be the best number of features to use. So here we have the best features that the model selected, ordered by R squared, which is how well the features can be reconstructed from the Chinese features. So on top we have fairly easy stuff like number of words, number of sentences, and then we have a bunch of vocabulary diversity features, and then a few syntactic features as well. And then you got a bunch of features here, and then as you go down the list, this is only the first 25, but as you go down the list, you quickly get like a long tail of features that aren't very good, or they might and aren't very good because they just somehow don't really correspond to anything in the Chinese feature vector, and the R-square just very poor. So this line here is the top 13 features, and if you take the top 13 features, then you get the best model for your combined Spearman law. And here we have an ablation study. So this is studying how many open subtitles samples do you need to train this feature correspondence model. Right. So you notice that the horizontal scale is logarithmic. It's 10 and 100, 1000, 10,000, and the vertical axis is your model Spearman rho that you get at the end. If you use that many samples to train your correspondence model, then then how much score do you get? And you see that it increases pretty rapidly until you hit around 1,000 or 2,000 features, 1 or 2,000 samples, and then after that it kind of levels off. So you don't actually need like millions and millions of parallel sentences to train this model. You only need like 1 or 2,000 parallel sentences. So in fact, this is important because this makes it applicable to a lot of languages where you can just gather like a few thousand parallel sentences, which is not a lot. You don't need millions to train such a model. Okay, so that's most of the results. Let's go back and summarize what we did. So this is a first use of natural language processing and machine learning to detect dementia in Mandarin Chinese. The previous works, all previous work was done in English. So this is what we did in Chinese. First, we extracted the lexical syntactic features in English and Chinese, and doing this independently. And second of all, we use out-of-domain movie dialogue corpus to train a correspondence model. This is a blue model here. This is the model that learns to map feature vectors in Chinese to feature vectors in English. And then lastly, we combine this with an English dementia classifier that takes in English features and produces an Alzheimer diagnosis. And when we combine this combined model beats all the previous baselines. And for the future work, there are a bunch of things that we can improve in this model. First of all, we do need human transcripts. So the model assumes that you have the text of the model, the text of a speech. It doesn't work with acoustic data. It only works with text data. So it doesn't look at things like how fast you're speaking or how many pauses you have. It only looks at the transcripts of the data because this is what's most easiest to transfer between languages. Right. And in the future work, we can also apply it to other languages. So does it work only for Chinese, or does it also work for other languages as well? And does it still beat the baselines in other languages? So we have some data in French, and we're working on collecting some data in Korean as well. So future work would be to apply the same method to other languages. But overall, it's quite a challenge to in this field to do multilingual Alzheimer detection, just because of the lack of data sets. So we do need to have ongoing efforts to collect data in multiple languages, and right now a lot of efforts are kind of hampered by the lack of quality data. So this is obviously very expensive to enroll people in these kind of studies, and you have to be aware of privacy concerns. But I would say this is one of the main challenges in this field, just lack of good data that you can use to train your models. So that's it for now. Hopefully you learned something, and thanks for tuning in. If you want to if you want more details, I'm going to present a link in the description where you can get my whole thesis and also a short version, like 5-page conference version of the paper that I submitted to NACO. So yeah, hope to see you there.